Sir Kenneth, what is the most important thing to know about you?
About me? Oh, well, that I'm still the right side of the grass, I suppose. Really. Oh, goodness. I think I am uncommonly lucky insofar that I got into this trade at a time when there really weren't so many of us doing it. And the clients who were at that time pretty much all local, they had no experience of employing designers either.
Right.
So it's a very happy sort of, you know, catch as catch can arrangement. At the same time, there was and had been established for quite a long time a very ethical organisation, which at the time was called the Council of Industrial Design, later called the Design Council. This Design Council was a very honest broker between the manufacturers of almost anything at all and the people they wanted to employ, who were the designers.
You mentioned that a lot of those people were ex-services and you did national service. How do you think that affected the designer that you became?
Difficult to answer it, but I think I have quite a fond memory. I certainly didn't look at it at all fondly when it came up. You know, I was 18 or whatever it was, or 19, I think. And it was, in the beginning, fairly unpleasant and bloody rigorous. I mean, physically rigorous, and you pitchforked into a society, a group of, say, 40 men, from a terrific variety of backgrounds. You can't believe the mixture. Now, I think on reflection, you learned a hell of a lot about getting on with people. I think you're either blessed with a certain amount of luck or an exceptional amount of luck. I think I got an exceptional lot of luck. After I'd been through that, you know, rigorous 6-9 months of just basic training, I was drafted into what they call the engineers, and in the engineers there's a terrific spectrum of systems. They have architects even, and they have builders, and they have painting departments and transport departments, a terrific scope. So if you read a bit of news today about, you know, some terrible bloody affair going on somewhere, some of the first most important army men are those who are in the engineers. So they have an architectural category, and I was called an architectural grade 3, and I got more money, which was also pretty attractive. But thereafter, this little category you'd be put into was planted in different places. So I was then planted, only myself, in a bloody great camp of other soldiers, and I had my own funny little office. And most of the work I did was helping my boss, the local officer, to paint the backgrounds for his amateur theatricals, which is the most important thing in his life. So I fell on my feet, and then from there I got somehow drafted into, which was important, a department which actually printed instruction books. This department was full of wonderful draftsmen, wonderful artists, whose job was to dismember mechanisms and draw them into elegant diagrams, which would then be published to give to these poor buggers who might fire them one day. So there I learned about printing, and I learned about the value of illustration, and I learned about it's the origins of an interest and a thought process about where graphics can be useful, as opposed to entertaining or informative, etc.
And you mentioned that you were a drafting assistant and you worked for architects like Katz and Vaughan when they were working on the Festival of Britain, and later for Jack Howe. Yeah. And you've talked about working for people like that as the other part of your education. Tell me a little bit about some of those people and how they influenced you.
Well, I think it was the most influential thing in my life, actually, because I came from my dad was a policeman and my mum worked in a factory and so on. I was a very happy home, but very conservative, very predictable, you know, tassels, uncut maquette, red, cream, you know, the actual perfect vernacular of sort of middle class. But there I landed a job in an architect's office. I didn't even know what architects did. You can't believe how ignorant I was. I don't glamorise this, it's an absolute truth. And I went to work in this office as a sort of gopher. I got a very modest job. But all the walls were white, the doors were painted different colours, and the most unlikely furniture I'd ever met in my whole bloody life, that was their world. And it's what today you can see was modernism. And it was absolute influence, never ever lost me. And I still bang on about it as I will today.
Tell me about the moment that you brought the Atomic Energy Authority exhibition project into Jack Howe and he told you to resign and go and do it on your own. That must have been quite terrifying.
God knows where it started, where they came to call me in his office, but I got a job from the Atomic Energy Authority, which was the government established supra organisation to manage the use of nuclear physics in the future. And they asked me to design a little exhibition on the South Bank called, can make it like Nuclear is Good or something, I can't remember. And so I did this little exhibition and I was paid for it and it was a relative success, they were pleased. And so I went away. And then one day, right out of the blue, 6 months later, the same people called me and said, we've got another job, would you like to do it? So of course I said yes. And off I go in my lunchtime on the bus and whatever, and I go to this office down in the city, and they had got this job, which was then the first of a big went on for year on year, went to a big exhibition in Geneva about the peaceful uses of atomic energy as a sort of big symposium right across Europe. A big event you can see historically. And of course I said yes and loved to do it. On the way back in the bus, I realised what I'd said yes to, which was a huge job. I mean, just in square footage, like bigger than this whole bloody building. I mean, immense. And I thought, you know, you've cut off, bitten off more than you can chew today, Grange. So I thought, I know what I'll do. Jack, who's done the odd exhibition design, a proper architect, very organised outfit, I thought he'll be delighted to get the job. So as it were, give him the job, as long as I can do it in the office. So I'm still just an oik, I'm still only 21 or 2 or something, a kid really. And I went into Jack and I said, look, there's this job that I've been offered and I'd like to, like you to do it. And to my horror, absolute, I really shat myself. He said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I think you should do it. And he had the wit and the generosity to see that this might be the making of a man's life. And it was. And so I left him that week because it was only got 6 months on to go or something. And within a month I was employing 4 people. A huge job, and of course it grew and grew. They then decided they wanted it in 5 languages and then 9 languages. So the amount of graphics, I mean, I was trotting out graphic design all night, on night.
Do you think there is still that generosity towards the next generation in the design industry?
But my feeling is that if I meet an architect, there's a pretty good chance that they're a fairly decent person, and it follows therefore that they're likely to be decent employers and therefore relatively generous.
Yeah.
Now, against that, the whole scene, the whole society is forced into less and less generosity. It's a great world of grasping every opportunity. Now, I don't think it's that it makes them bad people. It's just that we've made a world where money is the absolute only driver. And therefore you're hard pressed to build an organism like a company which is wealthy enough to be generous.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about Pentagram. You were one of the founding partners in 1972. Tell me a little bit about that time and how Pentagram came about.
So I'd been working for Kodak and I'd been entrusted with all sorts of jobs, including advice on where to go for a new corporate identity for Kodak, which is a nice, handsome job. And I knew a few of the top graphic designers, including Crosby, Fletcher, Forbes. I was on the client side of the table looking at these guys. And I didn't need to take the lead, but it was quite obvious that the ones who on the day were the best candidates were Crosby, Fletcher, Forbes. So we gave them the job. That's Kodak gave them the job, a nice handsome job for them, and they went off into the sunshine and did their graphics, and I'm happy on my side, on my own studio up in Hampstead. And then I got a call from Colin to say they'd landed a job for a firm called BP, and it was initially packaging, but they looked as though they were in line to get a much bigger job, which was the design of a self-service station. And would I like to come along and join in, you know, actually be a helper? And of course I said yes, and so we did this job together, and it was a wonderful job. You wouldn't conceive today of asking someone to do the job of an attendant who used to walk out in his bloody sou'wester and fill your tank. You wouldn't conceive of transferring that job to somebody without giving them protection. But that hadn't got through the thinking. And so the most useful thing we did was put lids over every filling station in the country. So that then led to us meeting one another much more often. I was looking for a new office with a stronger floor for the workshop, and they were looking for a new office because they were going to get slung out the old one. And so we said, well, look, why don't us both keep our eye open? If we come across a bigger building, we'll split it down the middle, but one thing led to another, and the building we found didn't split down the middle very easily. So we agreed on a common front door, and before we knew where we were in partnership.
Quite interested in the atelier structure that Pentagram has with independent partners, with independent business, all having an equal share in the business.
Yep.
Was that something that came about, as you said, of the way things that happen and you wanted the industrial design bit, or was it a sort of philosophy that you wanted to instill from the beginning? Because it's still run that way, isn't it?
Yes, and I think it's a very personal way of looking at something. I think, you know, we all think we're stars, and we all think that we're God's gift to mankind. But we'd also started, which is a great asset, we'd started and were already well established enough to have our own names, our own, you know, marketable, as it were, product. And therefore, none of us wanted to, or there was no necessity for any of us to give up being personalities in our own right. Yeah. So it follows that when you start to run the firm, it's run as a set of individual businesses in a sense. And the clients like that too, because I think they know. It's like going to a big medical practice. You're quite happy to go through the door because they've got bigger machines and all the rest of it. But you have to believe that that particular doctor treats you as though you were his only client. And I think it's a trick I think that the medical trade is missing at the moment. But if you were to set out a practice, a medical practice, you could have 100 doctors under the, you know, on the list on the front door. But if every one of them had their own clients, and so it comes to be a very intimate relationship, which is the heart of any good, you know, consulting arrangement. I think that's very valuable. So that was the sort of model we slipped in. So entirely selfishly, it wasn't a piece of planning at all. It was just that we were bloody sure we weren't going to give up our own moment in the sun, and so we established it as an all practice. And it's not a bad promise to give someone, because we always had the idea, we've got one or two that have grown up inside, but we always had the idea that new partners would only be taken on if they had already made their own name, if they were known, not in a huge way, but known well enough in their own right to have their own clients who trusted them as persons. So I think that's in itself not a bad model, but you can only do it when you've been up and running long enough for you individually to have made your reputation.
You've been described as a pioneer of user-centered design, so designing products according to their purpose and function, and you've said that you want products to be a pleasure to use. Why is it so important that form follows function in that way, rather than, you know, the aesthetic taking priority?
I don't start with an assumption that I know better. Therefore, I start the only thing I can get hold of is whether it worked well or not.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you first met and how you came to work with Anglepoise?
When I was at art school, my mum had a job in a firm in a little factory making springs. And it was a factory of 12 people behind a pub in Harsden, and I used to go there in the evenings and weekends. It was a little job. But in the firm, and springs were all handmade, and so there'd be tiny, tiny springs, like watch springs, tiny things, to walloping great springs, all made by hand, wonderful, really wonderful skills, but all handmade. But this firm knew that somewhere in the sort of sky, there's a bloody great edifice, a firm called Terry, who makes springs for the gentry and the million, a massive firm. So it was a bit like making your own motorbike and knowing there's a firm out there called Rolls-Royce. It's that sort of relationship, you know. So Terry has somehow got stuck in Grange's mind. So when I sit next to this fella 40 odd years later, and he says his name's Terry, I can't resist telling him this bloody story, you see. And it turns out to be the same guy, same firm. Now, it's another little illustration of how life is formed by accidents, and some of them are wonderfully, you know, happy, and it never was other than that.
What advice would you give to a young designer now?
Work 80 hours a week.
Simple.